This is Floss Weekly, episode 762, recorded Wednesday, December 20th, Spilling the Tea. Hey, I'm Jonathan Bennett. This week, Simon Phipps joins us, and we talk with Neal Gompa, a Fedora maintainer and ex-Red Hatter, and we cover everything from what's wrong with open source to what Red Hat got right about CentOS. All that and more. You don't want to miss it, so stay tuned. Hey, good morning, or good evening, good afternoon, whatever time it is, wherever you are. It's Floss Weekly, the show about open source. And you know what? It's not just me, of course. We've got the wonderful Simon Phipps with me. Simon, it is always a pleasure to have you with us.
That's very kind of you to say so, and I hope you still think it at the end.
I'm sure I will. Simon, my opinion of you is we occasionally don't agree on things, but you've always been gracious and well-reasoned in the reason why, and I appreciate that. I feel like you're one of the people that I could pretty much any conversation, I could sit down over a cup of coffee and have it with you, and we would still pretty much be friends at the end of it. Now, over something like Twitter, maybe not so much, but over a cup of coffee, we would be great.
Yeah, well, what I love is that everyone still calls it Twitter.
Yeah,
I'm okay with Twitter. I call it Twitter.
I don't think anyone should stop calling it Twitter because I think that really hurts the.
It does.
The guy.
So to jump ahead, we've got Neal Gompa with us today, and Neal,
Hi.
Yeah, Neal is the lead of the Fedora KDE Special Interest Group. He's been a Fedora project contributor for a long time. He's also a contributor to CentOS, which sort of doesn't exist anymore. We'll ask him about that. openSUSE, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Neal, welcome to the show.
Hi. It's been a long time. Hi again.
It has. It's been like 11 years since you were last on Floss Weekly.
Yeah, 2011, I believe.
Quite recently, then.
Not that long ago.
I think back then you guys were experimenting with doing video stuff and had like fancy lower thirds, and everything was 4x3.
Yes. So we're kind of as a podcast, we're kind of in it's like we bought a new to us car and we're still settling into us. After a long time of very graciously hosting the show over at Twit, that came to an end, and we were able to find essentially a new sponsor here at Hackaday, and I think it's a great fit. I'm looking forward to what comes of it. So it'll take a few shows, I'm sure, to really settle into that. But I'm excited going forwards. And the other thing to mention is Doc Searles, who has been a great host for a couple of years now, is essentially ready to retire from the big chair. And so we've all put our heads together, and I'm going to take it going forwards. And we've got Doc has agreed to be one of the rotating panel of co-hosts. So he's still going to be involved with the show some. So we're super excited about that. But Neal,
that means you guys are on the cusp of a new generation.
Yes, it's like the fourth season. I'm calling it the fourth season of Floss Weekly because you had the one where Leo hosted it, and then you had Randall hosted it for years and years and years, and then Doc, and now we're here at Hackaday. It's the fourth season. But
yeah, for me it was with Randall, so that was
it was a long time ago. So we are not here to talk about Floss Weekly because that is navel gazing. We're here to talk about, well, I guess whatever Neal wants to talk about. Tell us. I'm curious to hear your story of how you got from the little tiny CMS that you were developing while you were in college to being what all are you? An ex-Red Hatter, a Fedora sponsor, the Fedora KDE guy. What did it look like to get from there to here?
A lot of twists and turns. Lots and lots of... I was actually a Fedora guy even back then, although I was not a very well-known one. Mm-hmm. I was in my little circle here doing packaging a couple of little things and being a user and whatever. During my time in college, I got my taste of actually being involved in other projects and really going in bigger into the space. I helped when the first Humble Indie bundle reached its milestones and had its games open source. I wound up becoming the de facto lead of that, and for the Lugaru game, and had that going. And that was actually my first open source project that like somebody else's open source project that I had actually contributed to. in a meaningful way, like in terms of code and things like that. And and I credit Ryan Gordon, Icarus,
Hmm.
for those who may not know that name, as the person who kind of gave me the frame of reference of how to be involved and shepherd an open source community. And from there, I kind of I bounced off of that into lots of other things. And then when I graduated college, there was a dip for for a year, and then I switched jobs, moved across the country, and started getting really involved in open source all over the place because my employer, at the time, Datto, was really big into supporting engagement in open source stuff, and that allowed me in to flourish in many interesting ways. And you'd see that I wound up starting getting involved in different projects, contributing to little patches here and there and fixing things, and then turning into becoming the KDE SIG lead, getting involved in Fedora Cloud, being involved in Fedora Workstation, Server, Snaps, Flatpaks, let's see, now OBS Studio and Multimedia and FFmpeg and GStreamer and now Wayland and all this other stuff. Like, it just kind of snowballed from there. And of course, and there's some side
Ah,
alongs of getting involved in openSUSE, becoming a contributor, helping to stand up governance for openSUSE Leap, and then becoming a member of the openSUSE board. I also did some similar stuff in Magia and Open Mandriva, contributed a little bit to Yocto here and there. So like I kind of just went everywhere. Um, Partly because in some respects I could, and because I kind of feel like this is my way of giving back to society and communities at large with the skills that I do have. Because what good is this if I can't help make the world just a tiny bit better in the way that I can?
sure. I did not know that you were involved with OBS Studio. So that's part of the technology stack that we're using right now. That's where our three frames get mixed together and sent back, and that's where one of our recordings happen. So I probably interacted with you at least a little bit. I sent, it's been a couple of months ago now, I sent a patch in to OBS fixing a very annoying and long-standing bug about where it looked for audio outputs on Linux. And of course, there was a bug in the bug fix, and so we actually broke things for people and had to fix it in the next revision, which is pretty typical. Uh,
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, for the most part, like I've just been involved. Like I got involved in OBS Studio because I was trying to bring OBS Studio to Fedora
mhm.
and CentOS, and packaging it up for users, and making fixes here and there, doing adjustments, and also testing patches that
Right.
for new things like all the Pipewire stuff,
Mhm.
some of the AV1 stuff, things like that. Like, um, I do a lot in Fedora around multimedia, and kind of side along with the stuff I do in Fedora KDE and other places. And so, OBS Studio is, and I stream on Twitch personally
Mhm.
for just whenever I'm doing code work or playing games on Linux or whatever. And so I wanted it to work for me too. So that was a big part of why I got involved in that.
That's very very classic open source involvement you've got there, Neil. So I'm having a conversation elsewhere at the moment about how people do open source and yet stay alive.
Oh,
Is there a connection between your ongoing existence and being involved in open source, or is it just something your ghost does?
well, so I would like there to be a connection between those two. Currently, I set up a GitHub sponsors a couple months ago.
Hey,
Uh,
I get $1 a month from that.
well, so I set up a
Oh,
GitHub sponsors a couple months ago because life circumstances happened, and you know it the result is no income that allows me to like eat and live on my own, basically, without stuff. Anyway, so I set that up because I've actually never been paid for open source work before. Even you mentioned I was ex Red Hatter. I didn't do open source development for Red Hat. So I wasn't. So like even when I was at Red Hat, I wasn't doing that. That was not my job. So all in the entire time that I've been doing open source work, it has been side along nights and weekends, fitting it into the schedule or coercing someone to care and let me do it on work time. And that's kind of it. If you think about that and think about all the stuff that I have done, that's kind like
Yeah.
sometimes I look at it and it's kind of mind blowing.
It's kind of a bit head scratching. So I mean, this is all very relevant, I think, because I'm looking at open source and free software at the moment, and I see. I've spent a year dealing with the European Commission over some legislation, and it's clear that the people who write legislation for the European Commission see open source as something that big West Coast corporations do to sink the cost of the platform so that they can focus on the innovation. And they don't see any dimension of it being individual people doing things. Do you think that dream of people being able to live, libertarian dream, self-powered, activity-funded lives, is that all over? Is the only way to live now with open source to go work for somebody who's strip mining it?
Well, wow, you ask all the hard questions.
That's what we like, Simon.
That's why I'm here.
That's Simon's job.
Yeah. So, I don't know if I would characterize all of the West Coast companies that are doing open source stuff as strip mining. It kind of varies from the companies in terms of how their inner culture is. Like, I like to compare, when I talk to people about West Coast companies, I like to compare Google and Facebook/Meta. And the reason I like to compare those two is because they have 10 years apart in terms of their founding. And 10 years makes a huge difference in approach for IT. So 10 years, 1996 for Google, open source was a curiosity. Open source was also, as a term, not that well known. And
hadn't been defined then.
Yeah, no, it was like 2 more years before
until 1998.
At that point, it still was referring to military intelligence.
Yes. Oh boy, yes, that's true. I like to pretend that I don't know that, but I had family friends who were in the military, so I know that. But back then it was a curiosity. Free software, FLOSS as a whole was smaller, more insular, right? GCC was having its problems back then of being too cathedral-like. That was still a thing going on. Like that's the frame of reference of that time frame. And there was a lot of skepticism about the survivability of free software. And we of course now know that that's even remotely true. It has definitely survived multiple decades at this point. But when you think about it culturally from that standpoint, from how those firms started up back then, companies like Google, they took a very insular approach to adopting software as a whole. So they will take things inside, they will feed it, they will adapt it, and they don't do anything else, really, for a lot of it. And again, this is the time frame in that it was normal for that to happen. Like the BSDs, the whole reason, in my view, that the BSDs wound up being a fork mess was because this underlying culture that essentially made it more or less acceptable for all the BSDs to splinter. There was also the lack of the charismatic individual and all the other things, but
yeah, I mean, more than acceptable. I mean,
it was normal.
I was always told that a paraphrase of the BSD license, as far as Bill Joy was concerned, was "Here's my cool stuff, take it and don't bother me."
Yep, exactly.
And
it was a very normal thing.
And so, I do think that was very much a reason why there was that fragmentation. I think there was also an ideological basis. It was that, nobody wanted to find themselves in an unexpected relationship with a weirdo.
Yeah, well, there was a lot of little problems like that, but like the underlying cultural basis is it's a take and modify rather than a give and take kind of relationship.
And that's what Apple is all the way down. I mean, the fact that Apple is, I think Apple's still got Darwin down there in the basement somewhere.
Yeah, and they still release snapshots of it with every macOS release. You can still go download them. They're kind of useless, but they're there. But like that again, this is what we're talking about here. This is the time frame that you look at a lot of these companies that became giants. In the 90s, that's the culture. Then you fast forward 10 years, and you've got Mark Zuckerberg creating Facebook off of a Fedora Core 4 box in 2005, 6, and his time frame, he's now open source has this underground culture that of give and take. It's become much more acceptable to use, reuse, remix, and redistribute. And they grow up with Fedora and then later moving on to CentOS and all these other things. And their approach to open source differed from Google in that whenever they've made open source projects, they made a basic effort to make it usable outside of Facebook and then later Meta. And if you look at Google projects, for example, TensorFlow and whatever, and versus PyTorch, one of the key differences between the two is that from a contributor or a developer perspective, TensorFlow looks like it was just carved out of Google 3, and it uses all the weird Google infrastructure and other tooling to do it.
Yep.
Whereas PyTorch uses common tooling that other open source developers use for building and adapting projects. It uses CMake. It's a standard Python binding to C++. It uses well-known libraries. It's still weird and terrible because all data science software is weird and terrible because software is not their shtick. And yeah, but the differing philosophies makes a big difference. Like TensorFlow is not in any Linux distribution because it's so bloody hard to actually deal with. Whereas, you now have PyTorch and Fedora and the AI/ML SIG, and they're building up all the extensions and packaging them up and doing the integration work. And that's because that fundamental philosophical difference in the span of 10 years influenced how those companies approach open source. Now, that's not to say that they're all doing it 100% right either, right? There's still, as you said, quote unquote, strip mining going on all over the place. There's a lot of use and reuse, and there's more value taken in than going back out. That's true. But that difference of approach you can see with later companies versus earlier ones. The sad fact is, though, most of the biggest companies are the earlier ones and not the later ones. You've got your IBM, you've got your Microsoft, you've got Amazon. Again, all of these people don't remember that Amazon is actually a 90s era company. And that's a big, big deal. And that makes a big impact on how they think about things because they're still stemming from that base culture, even though all the people have changed. All the the leadership from back then are obviously not in charge now, but it sticks. Those are the kinds of things that stick.
So in that worldview, to bridge back to the putative subject, where does RHEL fit in? What is Fedora? Because Fedora is still not the property of an independent legal entity. It's still this. It's not even as kosher as Debian. It's not even an entity-free thing floating in space. It is this. It is very solidly a piece of Red Hat IP, and they will cut you off from it if the CEO changes and IBM decides that should be so. So where has that flowed from? Has that come from the 80s BSD CentOS world? Has it come from the 90s of the Google folks who do open source as a natural resource? Is it coming from the 2000s of Facebook doing open source because they were told it was cool and that giving back was smart? Where does it come on that timeline?
So I think the appropriate answer to here is actually a little bit of 80s and 90s. So if you look at Red Hat's own history, they were primarily an integrator all the way up until they acquired and merged with Cygnus. Now, Cygnus is what is really the turning point for Red Hat as a company. If you look at Cygnus, Cygnus was actually a developer. They did work in GCC. They did work in free software as a whole, and they made a business and a reputation on being able to do things for people in code bases. And that stems from the 80s, where you had, commercialization, you had shells of commercial entities around academic projects to double serve, between both the academic world and then you had the commercial industry, right? Like this is how BSDs and CentOS and all these other things worked, right? You had this weird double entity setup where somebody does some parts of it and someone else does some parts of it. And you can see that a lot of early commercialization efforts in Linux follow that same model. And Red Hat has generally, in my view, kind of in ethos followed that model. In some respects, I think one of the reasons why they don't do foundation entities is because, this, as the story goes, from people I've talked to, when they tried to set up a Fedora Foundation, there was a bunch of companies and a lot of people that said that they would sign up and put in the money. And then when the paperwork actually came, nobody wanted to do it. And then OIN came into existence and all this other stuff. And so the reasons for doing a Fedora Foundation just kept getting wiped off the slate. And so we got left with this weird situation where technically Fedora is, as a project, a loose association of individuals that has affiliations with a entity that owns the trademarks but not the organization, which is a very strange place to be, but is also now the most common way open source projects are set up. It is, if you look at the vast majority of open source projects, they're either implicitly or explicitly in this style. And whether that's a good or a bad thing, there are pluses and minuses to this approach.
Absolutely.
But it is what it is. It's, if I want to say that it's anything, I think this sort of came out as a 2000s era way to do the 80s style thing, which is the worst of all choices. But it is what it is, right? Like, outside of Debian and Arch and a few others, most Linux distribution projects are actually done this way. Most open source projects are done this way. Is it a great thing? Sometimes. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I don't know. Actually, more often than not, it seems to work out fine. Is it always good? No. I mean, OpenOffice is a great example of how this went horribly wrong. And you know that better than I do.
Yeah. Well, and in your universe, CentOS as well.
Right. CentOS was even weirder.
Didn't necessarily go the way everyone would have wanted it to.
Well, well, when it comes to CentOS, I think so. I was kind of in there and involved in the project as the transitions and all this stuff happened. In some so I was, the way that I would probably put this is, this was a change that needed to happen, and nobody likes changes like this because you're kind of taking people's cheese away, and it's unpleasant. But one of the things that I used to complain about in the early days of when I was getting involved in this stuff back in 2015, 2016, was that I had found bugs on a regular basis in Red Hat Enterprise Linux and in CentOS and whatever. Mm-hmm. And I would ask for ways to get these fixed, because like, I can make the fixes. Like, they're like, oh yeah, great, go send them in Fedora and wait a nebulous number of years before they show up.
Well, fix will land in Fedora 40, and then when RHEL 10 finally comes out in 5 years, it'll be there.
Right. Well, so like, remember that this is also during the time where Red Hat was unable or unwilling to put a release cadence for RHEL. So you could have one that's 4 years, you could have one that's 3 years, you could have one that's 5 years. For example, RHEL 7 and 8 were both late. That is how big of a problem that was. The RHEL 8 to RHEL 9 was the first time that we had this, like, we're sticking to the cadence and actually putting things out on time. And a lot of that is because they started opening stuff up and getting things done earlier. RHEL has always been a very weird open source product, because in contrast to all the other Red Hat products, until very recently, it was not openly developed. You couldn't see what was going on, and you really didn't have an avenue in which to contribute or engage with the developers. When they created CentOS Stream in 2019, the idea of opening it up came from tons of partners and customers and community feedback of like, we know this stuff is broken. we can fix these things. Give us a path to doing it. And also, like, we don't really care about all the other things that you're talking about in RHEL land, but what we do care about is having something that we actually can reasonably prove is something that is actually open, right? One of the big challenges that enterprise Linux has, and to the lesser extent, and commercial Linuxes overall have, is that more often than not, they're essentially black boxes. Like, you cannot figure out what's going on, how they're being developed, how to change them, how to feed back into them, that sort of thing. If you go back 5 years, that means before CentOS Stream and before openSUSE Leap closing the Leap gap, there was no way you were going to be able to figure out how to get a bug fix in to a RHEL release. There was no way you were going to figure out how to get a feature into CentOS or SLE, and that's a big problem, especially if you're talking about, as a company, that your virtue is your stuff's open and everyone is part of the success of those things. Well, how are they if they can't do it? Now, there are a couple of ways that Red Hat screwed the pooch on this, and I refer you to when they canceled Red Hat Linux and made Fedora. That they made all the same mistakes a second time. And my theory is that Red Hat doesn't have organizational memory anymore of these things. So over the time frame since Fedora happened in 2003 to CentOS Stream, the CentOS changes in 2020, everyone who was involved in that, everyone who was part of that, everyone who was influential in that was gone for one reason or another. And so the underlying organizational memory that keeps you from making bad decisions and taking bad approaches to even good decisions is just not there.
It's like every corporation needs to write their own Bible over the years from these terrible mistakes that they've made in the past and pass them down like holy scriptures. Do not promise 7 years of support and then drop it only after one. It seems like one of those core doctrines.
I know you're joking about that, but that, like, legitimately, I think companies would be better served by having a working, living history document of some sort that actually tracks their decision making. We do this with source code when we have, with Git, with version control, with logs, and a good commit message is supposed to explain why you're doing it. A bad commit message is just 3 dots because you've used the Git default message for when you don't actually want to put anything in there.
Oh, that hits a little too close to home, man. Yeah.
So, like, I actually am on the side of, like, CentOS is actually a good thing, and I think that CentOS Stream makes the CentOS name more true than it was before, because people are actually able to influence it, not to the same degree of, say, in Fedora, but I will take anything for a step forward for more openness and more community collaboration. Do I like the way that was done? Oh God, no. Do I? But, like, overall, I think longer term, it's probably actually going to be a good thing for everyone involved.
So I know Simon wants to talk about this because he is involved with one of the CentOS replacements. I want to get in real quick. I would tend to agree with you. I do like CentOS Stream. We were all sad when CentOS went away. I think there were 2 things that really soured everybody, and one is CentOS 8. We were told that we would have support for 7 years or whatever, a long time. And there were some of us that were early adopters, and we went out and we rolled CentOS 8 on customers' machines. I had CentOS 8 boxes in people's offices because this is the new Linux. It's going to be around for 7 years. This is what we need. And then support dropped after a year. And it's like, oh man, really left in the lurch. And then the other thing that I think really soured people on it is when Red Hat took over CentOS, because CentOS was a community project before it was Red Hat. Red Hat took over CentOS and really became the kind of the master of it. Not that long passed before they killed it, right? And
2014 to 2019 is 5 years. So
I mean, I guess 5 years is forever when it comes to software.
Yeah.
So anyway, I know Simon wants to talk about this. I am sure. I can see it.
I don't know whether I want to talk about it or not.
He feels compelled to
The
talk
topic's
about
been
it.
brought up.
Yeah, the topic has been raised, so Your Honor, I feel compelled. So yeah, I helped start the Alma Linux project.
Yeah. I'm an Alma Linux member.
And fantastic. You missed the elections. You didn't stand in them. I'm very sad.
Well,
You can only be on so many boards at once.
my life's been a bit of a mess for the past few months, so
you would have been very welcome. You would have been very welcome on the board. Anyway, so
We'll
the
see
reason
next
Alma
time.
Linux exists is because CentOS Stream is very cool and all that. But if you're someone like CERN, and you can only update your operating systems in January.
Every few years, January, not even every January.
Yeah. To have somebody in the middle of your deploy cycle say, "Oh, by the way, that's it. It's all over," it is really
not fun.
is not great.
True.
And then they're not the only ones. But I did go and see them, and it's totally awesome over there in Switzerland. But so I looked at that and I thought, well, what Red Hat wants to do is it basically wants to eliminate this segment where people want to use, they basically want RHEL, but they don't need Red Hat. And I felt that the difficulty with CentOS, it was all very cool and all that, doing CentOS Stream, if you were a dedicated Red Hat user, customer, follower. But if your motivation for being there was that you wanted to use RHEL, you were part of their ecosystem of the holosphere, but there was a part of what you were doing where Red Hat wasn't a relevant part of the equation. I felt there had to be an operating system that fit into that jigsaw slot. And I felt that Red Hat was desperately trying to prevent anyone putting anything in that jigsaw slot. And I felt that the open source community really expected software freedom to yield a jigsaw piece for that slot.
Yeah.
I think so. That was the reason I did. That was the reason I got involved in Alma Linux. And so I look at CentOS Stream, and I think, cool stuff, guys. You definitely needed it for all of your cloud futures. But there's a valid reason why people want to have RHEL without Red Hat, and you're not meeting that need. And if you don't meet the need, somebody else will. And I thought it was very surprising and sad that Red Hat decided not to own that market sector, because they were completely in a place to own that market sector, be gracious to it, cultivate it, farm it. And they decided not to, and I'm mystified by that, because they've now put it in the hands of the great people at the great people at Rocky. They've now put it in the hands of us, community people over in Alma Linux, and basically they don't get a vote anymore.
So, couple of things here. The first thing is, I don't know if we wanted a world where Red Hat doesn't exist anymore, though. A big part of the problem is that, and I'm going to speak of some personal experiences here, right? I used to be a Red Hat customer. I've been a Red Hat partner. I am a Red Hat partner again for interesting reasons. But I was a Red Hat customer at one point, and I've had to engage with Red Hat sales, and it is a very interesting experience when you don't fit in the expected holes that they're looking to fill. But I think one of the other things that Red Hat started to recognize over the past few years is that they have somehow carved themselves out when they didn't want to. Some of the decisions that they made over the past, I want to say 12 years, 15 years, have gradually carved themselves further and further out of the spheres that they actually wanted to be in. And one aspect of this, again, from what I can see and say and whatever, one aspect of this is that them changing the dynamics here has also pushed them to make RHEL itself available for more groups of people at more affordable or no cost points. Like, for example, they have a program now for research institutions to get as much RHEL site-wide for bloody near nothing. if they want to. There are open source projects and open source infrastructure. There's now a formal program for this. Usually, it used to be that Red Hat informally would give projects that asked nicely enough infrastructure, resources, support, that sort of thing. Now there's a full-blown official program for doing this, and GNOME takes advantage of this, and I know of a few other projects that are trying to take advantage of this. I've helped projects take advantage of this. It's a real thing now. There's also, RHEL for individuals that allows people to get Red Hat Enterprise Linux for 16 instances for nothing. Like, you can use it for whatever purpose you want, even for production infrastructure, and things like that. I think the next frontier for them is going to be figuring out how they can carve out a commercially viable variant of RHEL that serves those markets better, because, like, as they are trying to get a grip on the impacts of their changes, and as they start working down the stack of affected people moving from CentOS to something, they're starting to, like, for the first time in a very long time, actually, like, analyze their position in the market and do something with it. And that's a great thing to do it now rather than never. But I also kind of wish that they did this like 10 years ago. A lot of the, but again, to kind of add on top of this, what you're talking about with Alma, I've always felt that the Alma Linux folks were on the right track for things. And yes, it sort of sucked. I would, like, where I was working at the time that the decision happened, we had a buttload of CentOS, and we were just about to start CentOS 8 deployments, literally just about to, and those were killed stone cold because of that. And I wound up working my Christmas holiday to figure out what we were supposed to do. That was not fun. I do not recommend. 0 out of 10. But
Yes.
so I have a lot of sympathy and empathy for people that were in this situation, because I've been there. But I've felt that, what the Alma Linux folks have done, the Alma Linux OS Foundation, like, I've talked to Igor personally a couple of times. I'm on good terms with many of the members of the Alma Linux Foundation board. I help with the project, and I maintain some stuff that they use. And, class act, all of y'all. And the thing that makes me feel good about Alma Linux is that there is this dedicated intentionality to actually be part of the larger Red Hat ecosystem as a contributor. It's not just about consuming, it's also about contributing.
Yeah.
And that's important to me. Like, personally speaking, that's something, like, I value very highly. Like, with the way that Alma Linux folks are doing it, like, if you have to make a derivative of RHEL, the way that you're doing it, I actually really like. I'm not a fan of the let's just slap the branding, change, and call it a day, and then suck the life out of everybody else in the process model, because I've seen where that goes. This story has a definite ending multiple times over, and no one is happy with the result.
We've written that into the governance, and this goes back to our conversation earlier about having an entity and having governance. The thing that we've tried to design into Alma Linux is that it's, that's why it exists. It exists to be the expression of a community need, not to be the expression of a VC-funded profit motive.
Yep.
And I think that makes all the difference about whether you decide that you're going to parasitize or whether you decide that you're going to transform. And I think Alma Linux is on the side of wanting to transform and wanting to be that jigsaw piece that fits in the whole, where you need RHEL, you love RHEL, you pay for RHEL, but not there.
Yeah, no, and there's always going to be these little awkward places where, like, the RHEL shaped hole, you can't take the Red Hat jigsaw piece and fit it in the RHEL shaped hole.
Yeah,
and that's where things like Alma Linux fit in. And I am very.
Oh, something happened.
Gone.
He's gone. He's back.
being in the yeah.
He's
There we
back.
go. I'm very happy with the
I
approach.
sense an edit coming on.
Yes.
Yeah, me too.
I-
That was weird.
That was.
I feel an
but
edit
yeah.
coming on.
Edit land. Mhm. But yeah, overall, what I feel about Alma Linux is that they're on the right track and what they're doing is great. And I hang out a lot with Jonathan Wright, and he's fantastic. He's
Right.
a class.
Johnson's great.
He's fantastic, and like I've helped him, with the Alma Linux infrastructure stuff, giving him guidance and finding him docs or patches or whatever, and things like that. I've helped him with contributing to CentOS Stream. Overall, I think Alma Linux can create a symbiotic relationship with RHEL and CentOS Stream and provide value where, a unique value proposition in its own right. And so I'm very happy about its existence. And here's the other thing. If Red Hat hadn't made that change, that wasn't going to happen. We wouldn't have had an enterprise Linux platform that is actually community oriented in a way where people can contribute to it. We have two now. We have CentOS Stream and we have Alma Linux. That is a net benefit for everyone.
Yep.
I've got to say, Alma Linux really won me over when they made the fix for ZenBleed available before anybody else did.
Yeah.
Red Hat kind of looked at that and went, it's not that big of a deal. And I looked at it and went, that's a really big deal. And apparently the guys at Alma Linux did too. And that's the one that won me over. And I think that's really what kind of confirmed that the way that this is now fit together, that you've got CentOS Stream flowing it down into Alma Linux, and Alma Linux can push back up and it eventually comes down into Red Hat. That model works. And that ZenBleed fix is kind of really what convinced me that there's something to this. And it's good for everybody that we've got this put together this way.
Yep. Yeah. No, it was. Well, I remember that whole incident dropping in our. We use Mattermost as our chat, and we have a group chat up there. I remember it dropping in, and we just assumed that it would immediately, the Red Hat would just pounce on it and immediately do something. And then we, stood and looked, and then we got a reply back from someone at Red Hat saying, yeah, we'll fold that into the next major release, and we thought, no, we can't do that. We've got to do it now.
You've got a buffer overflow in your CPU. This is a big deal.
But yeah, but think about this. You have the opportunity to make those choices.
Yes.
What if you didn't? What if you didn't have the agency to do that?
Oh, yeah.
Right? This is, people don't realize this, but while the communication sucked and the intentions of some people were clearly not great, the baseline intent of the decision by Red Hat to do this benefited everyone. Literally everyone benefited from the end result of this, because now you have community engagement models that didn't exist before. You have an enterprise grade platform that is actually community oriented, two of them, and you have a general intentionality to bring RHEL itself into the open, into the community space where it has not been in its entire existence. And yes, that's a big, slow-moving ship, and it's gonna take time, and they're gonna screw up over and over and over and over. But they're doing it, and that is important.
So, do you think that was a great big brain in North Carolina said, hey, we can make real the vision of software freedom? Or do you think that was, or do you think that was the usual game of? So what I think goes on, and I remember seeing this at MySQL at Sun. Sun bought MySQL. Sun's management immediately favoured the management side of MySQL, and it turned out MySQL had been living as this tension between management and engineering for all its existence.
Yep.
And as soon as you overweighted either side of that equation, the thing started getting unstable. And that was what I sensed was happening at Red Hat when CentOS Stream happened. I sensed that there was a disturbance in the force, and we were seeing an imbalance introduced into the tension at Red Hat, which is what I think has made it successful its entire life, which is that tension between the engineering universe of Red Hat and the marketing and business in universe of Red Hat, which, to my perception as an outsider, are two completely independent things connected almost at a point. And
I will say,
seemed...
as a former insider of Red Hat, you are very bloody close. Well, I was on the sales and business side of Red Hat, so which was weird because it was the only place I could. I like the circumstances of how I wound up on that side were very, very odd, but like. I wound up on the sales side of Red Hat, and so I got to see all the sales and businessy approaches to all the things, and I have many, many friends on the Red Hat engineering side, and my goodness, those could not be two different worlds. It is, and you were right. They are held on by a tiny little thread somewhere in the middle, deep in the core, and it probably is true that there was probably a little bit of a disturbance that tilted something one way versus the other.
3 letters. But anyway, I won't say.
Yeah, sure. Actually, I can at least confirm solidly that those 3 letters are not involved. They were just as upset as everyone else.
Interesting.
IBM, well, I'm going to say the 3 letters. IBM has a huge, huge fleet of CentOS. They were doing their own thing, their own, like, they bought SoftLayer and screwed it all up and turned it into the IBM Cloud and all that other stuff. That was all in CentOS. There was a whole, like, I have heard rumors of very interesting discussions between IBM and Red Hat over the whole thing before and after. So, it's a whole special place.
Oh, yes.
But what I would probably say, though, is it was definitely one of those tension things that things tipped over a little bit. But the clawback afterwards was pretty intense, right? Like, there was a lot more, the engineering side was like, all right, if we're going to do this, then we're going to, like, get to be more open and we get to do more things and we get to be more public about stuff. Like, that would not have happened if the first thing didn't happen, right? Because there is no incentive for them to do any of that stuff without something, like, the balance had to be restored somehow. And so the way that wound up happening was RHEL development became more public. Like, they started having to do everything public side. The original CentOS stream, when it first came out, living alongside CentOS Linux, was just snapshots of RHEL development just being pushed out with nobody to do anything with it. After a year of that, they started to decide to flip the model because there was this underlying pressure going on to change things. And that's when you started seeing this gradual shift, and then the switch over, right, to CentOS Stream being the only thing. Those are all aspects of this give and take that is happening inside based on this weird tension that exists between the 2 points that make up the Red Hat business, which is the engineering and everyone else. And I mean, it works out most of the time. Sometimes it doesn't. And then when it doesn't, you see glorious screw-ups like this. But like, 20 years ago, the same thing happened. Red Hat Linux 10 Beta 1 Red Hat Linux 10 was canceled after Beta 1. And then they made Fedora Core after that. And Fedora Extras got merged into the project and so on and so on. People dogged Red Hat for years after that. I'm sure you remember this, Simon, because, it was a whole thing for many years. And now today, Fedora is actually probably one of the best Linux platforms out there. And it is a much more community governed than anyone would have ever expected. I mean, you have Red Hatters themselves saying, you should not be accounting for Red Hat's needs here. That is a very special, like, and again, that comes from one of the things that people don't know about Red Hat is that some of its cultural is altruistic in nature, and it actually gets conveyed in a legal form. When you are an employee of Red Hat, you sign in a covenant that also states that you are supposed to put open source projects' needs, desires, and direction before the company's needs, and it is not considered a conflict of interest. That is extremely important, and it is extremely rare. And this is one of the things people don't really understand. And this is why I say Red Hat's this weird blend of these generations of cultures of how software and IT worked because of all these different things that make the company different and unique. And I promise you, not that many other companies do that. Like, I've worked for a few, and I've talked to people, and even more. Like, ain't no one's got one of those clauses in their employment agreements.
Yeah, that's pretty unusual.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like Tiresias, you've been on both sides.
Yeah.
Where does SUSE fit on this? The Hanseatic Red Hat. Where does openSUSE and SUSE has now, I can't work out whether they're independent or owned or floated or public or whatever at the moment. What's going on over there, and how do the two things compare? Is openSUSE even worth considering in a world as rich as the one you just described?
So we got to start with the motivations of why openSUSE exists in the first place, because that's an important starting point here. Novell bought SUSE and Symbian and decided to smush them together and hope for the best. That did not go well.
It never goes well.
So you have a company that's mostly German and KDE people combined with a company that's mostly Latin American and GNOME people. And you're told, figure it out.
And there's a few Salt Lake City Mormons in there as well.
Right. Don't forget the Mormons that are actually like the core of the Novell company, all in here, and then they say, figure it out.
Stir it out.
Yeah. At one point, Novell held half of all the GNOME developers at that, and then within a couple of years, they were all gone.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't matter because Novell made SUSE switch to GNOME. So, like, it didn't even help.
Yeah.
But that starting point, I want to use that as a reference here. Novell made openSUSE to be a competitor to Fedora. That is a very important distinction. They didn't have an altruistic motivation for doing it. They didn't have anyone distinctly pushing for some kind of outcome. Havoc Pennington is widely regarded as one of the people that made Fedora's baseline culture be the way it is, that makes it so successful, way back at the beginning of the Fedora project. Havoc Pennington and many others inside of Red Hat, both from the community side and internally, pushed very hard for Fedora to be the way it is today. There was no such push for openSUSE in the beginning. In fact, it was basically chaos for a little while. And I think that's kind of the story of SUSE, really, over the past couple of decades, is it's kind of just a little chaos here, and then little interesting stuff there, and a race to be something, to find their niche. Like, my personal view of SUSE has always been that their strongest point was custom Linux engineering and doing stuff on weird computer platforms.
Yeah.
Because they were the ones that ported to 64-bit x86. They got on the bandwagon for AMD 64. They got on the bandwagon for mainframes. They were the ones that originally brought Linux to the mainframe. They were the ones that brought Linux to PowerPC. They were the ones that did all of the, well, not the only ones that did the PowerPC stuff. There was a lot of people, but they did a lot in that front. And their expertise there is second to none. They really do a very good job of that. And they've carved niches out of that. Like, for example, some of the biggest retailers in the world, their entire infrastructure is SUSE based. From their point of sale systems to their server infrastructures to their clouds. Like, some of the biggest retailers in the world were like that. There's also like some of the most transformational, VoIP systems, hypervisor platforms, things like that. Like, you can find a sprinkle of SUSE in a lot of places if you look. And I think that's really, like, the key here is that SUSE's culture ultimately, it's a very German company because, founded in Germany and all that stuff, is a very do the thing kind of culture rather than talk about the thing. And so they've been quietly doing a lot of stuff for decades. And the problem with that is that, if you cut down a tree in a forest and nobody's around to hear it, did the tree actually fall? And that's SUSE's biggest problem. They don't know how to talk about themselves in a way that can attract people to their value proposition. And then if you kind of go, in the open source side, it's also the same problem. You have, admittedly, I think this is where it probably served them better because, like, if Novell and SUSE were actually upfront about why they did this, this would actually suck. It wasn't a good reason for them to make openSUSE, but openSUSE's success within its community led it to growing beyond a life of that, and so it succeeded despite its origins. And in many respects, I think openSUSE is actually a great project that has a lot of potential and can do a lot of things, but like a lot of open source projects, suffers from less than an ideal amount of investment. Um, and this is where, like, lately the community has, like, taken a little bit more direct action on this. At FOSDEM this year, the Geeko Foundation was created. It's a UK nonprofit that is working on supporting open source projects and doing things like that. And it sponsored the openSUSE conference this year, and it's going to do it again next year. And there's this, this larger effort to try to build a way for the community to be part of the sustainability of the openSUSE project, because I mean, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. SUSE is not exactly doing super great lately. And that probably has a lot to do with why they delisted. They are not publicly traded anymore. And I mean, their financials were a mixed bag for a while anyway. And their CEO got fired and replaced with another guy, and it's just, there's a whole lot of weird going on that place. But the SUSE's, I think SUSE fits in all the slots that Red Hat doesn't. And that's the way I kind of look at it. If you look at where SUSE is good and where Red Hat's good, there is no intersection. Like, almost no intersection. Red Hat tends to be good at the commodity stuff, the high scale kind of things, where you don't do a whole lot of your own modifications. You don't do a lot of custom engineering work. Red Hat does a really good job being in this space. But then you have the dark side of it, where you've got these projects and you've got these products that need a little bit of help here and there to kind of put a Linux-sized hole and fill it in and have icing on the cake so that it's actually maintainable. SUSE does a great job of that. And that's actually, like, it's one of those things that they've always been good at. Whether they take advantage of this and market it well, that's a separate question. But, if you want to think about another SUSE-sized hole that, hole that Red Hat doesn't have, is SUSE still sells SUSE Linux Enterprise Desktop. You can still buy supported desktop Linux from SUSE. If you go to SUSE.com/shop, it's still there. $50 and you have something. And $50 a year, but still, it's something, right? Red Hat used to be in this game, and then they're not anymore. And then there are various reasons for why, but the most important one is it just wasn't. It just didn't sell, and so they took that off, and so they don't have that. They do have RHEL Workstation, which is for high-end computers and offers a whole lot of other fanciness. To be fair, that product is basically the reason why we have Pipewire, why we have real progress on Wayland in the past few years, and all this other stuff that's been going on that's actually really cool that people do not realize is actually coming from Red Hat. And SUSE, well, I mean, the hole that Red Hat hasn't filled that SUSE is filling in, they're actually doing the things like, well, people need a way to do headless login into a Wayland desktop. Well, the guy that's working on it for GNOME, Yon Torres, is actually a SUSE employee working in openSUSE and contributing to GNOME to fill in this functionality. And so, like, this is where, if you look at the puzzle that makes up the Linux universe and how things get done, you will see that all the spots where Red Hat isn't in, usually SUSE is. For example, Red Hat is mostly in graphics. SUSE is mostly in sound. Takashi Iwai is the sound maintainer. He's a SUSE employee. If you look at, x86 and ARM and RISC-V, well, you'll see that where Red Hat is weak, you'll see SUSE is strong. So SUSE was the one that brought, officially kind of brought UEFI to the Raspberry Pi through U-boot. Like, they did the original work for that, and then it built on top of it to make Raspberry Pi, running Linux on a Raspberry Pi way easier than it used to be. And the reason they did that was they sold SLES for Raspberry Pi. You could buy SUSE Linux Enterprise Server supported for Raspberry Pi. You still can. I don't know if it's listed on the website, but I know it's still a product. And so, like, they're the only enterprise Linux. They're the only business Linux that you can, with support contracts and whatever, that you can buy for a Raspberry Pi today.
That's great.
Nobody knows that it exists, but they're the only one.
That's awesome.
So lots of loose ends here to tie up.
Yes.
Yeah.
I thought we were going to have you on and talk about Fedora 40 and KDE 6 and HDR and Pipewire and all of that stuff. But
Sorry.
we had Simon on as the guest, but no regrets. I love the conversation. We'll
have to do it again. Hopefully sooner than 11 years.
Actually, you want to come on again next week? We had a cancellation.
Yeah. Sure, why not?
I'll send you an email about that afterwards. I'll have one of the actual Linux guys, Linux desktop guys. Simon's not really a Linux desktop guy.
But he's a good dude.
Oh no, he's great. He is great. But if we want to talk about Linux desktop, I mean, he's running a Chromebook. Come on.
Yeah.
Yeah, he also has this controversial opinion that Chromebooks are the best Linux desktop ever.
I know.
They totally are. I mean, there's no question about it. I have all the ice cream and all the sauce. I don't have to pick between one or the other.
That's fair. So we've hit an hour. We've recorded for an hour, and we try to keep it to an hour per week. Neal, I want to ask before we let you go, let's just go with our standard 2 questions. That is, what is your favorite text editor and scripting language? What do you spend all day in?
So I am a Pythonista. I know a lot of programming languages, but Python is my favorite. I find that a language that I don't have to think about how to write, that when I look at it later, I can read.
So
you think that's a low bar for to some people, but man, it's actually like surprisingly difficult. A lot of languages do not have that built into the way that they're designed, and that makes me very happy. I'm a fan of literate programming, for example. And I find that with Python, I don't have to do a lot of extra work to make the code speak for itself. And so literate programming, just kind of it's a fun way to do things, but it's also a pain in the butt in most programming languages to do it that way. I feel like in Python, I don't even have to go out of my way to write code as if I would write prose. And so you can just read it and kind of go with it. It's a little quirky here and there, but like overall, it's a very readable thing. Now, text editors. Right. So I started with MS-DOS editor when I was a kid.
Which means that you like Nano now.
Right? Actually, yes. That is actually, yes. Nano, but also Emacs.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so like when I'm in like really intense kind of stuff and doing crazy programmer type things or poking around a lot of stuff, Emacs is usually my weapon of choice because it still has that feel. And it's very easy to just jump around and do a bunch of things and hit actions, open up files, and kind of live in the editor for a bunch of time and treat it sort of as a light IDE-ish environment. But like when I'm doing quick edits or just poking around stuff, Nano is my weapon of choice when it comes to editing files.
There's something about, I don't know if there's actual shared heritage there, but there's quite a few of us that grew up playing around with either the Microsoft DOS editor or MS-DOS QBasic.
Right, I did both.
And Nano, just you feel at home in Nano. I don't know exactly which way that flowed, or whether the Microsoft guys saw the old what
Pico.
was it? Yeah, Pico was really the heritage there. Maybe the MS-DOS guys saw Pico and stole that interface. Either way, it feels at home.
It does, doesn't it?
Yes.
The only thing that would make it more at home probably would be is if they did the god-awful, ugly, yellow and on blue, that DOS applications typically did, because it was a way to distinguish from the fact that you were in the command prompt.
Yeah. I'm sure there's a plugin or something to make that happen.
Probably.
Yeah, probably. All right, Neal, we have used up our time. Thank you so much for being here, and we may see you again next week. I will indeed touch base with you about that so that we can talk about
Sounds great.
KDE and Fedora stuff. Simon, what do you think?
Well, it's always good to talk about it, history, and try and derive futures from it.
Yes.
And,
yes.
I'm I'm noticing there's a whole wave of people coming in who don't have any of the history of where open source came from, and they're about to make many of the same mistakes. And
They are making the same mistakes. It's not they're about to; they are.
they are okay. And I think it's really important to talk through all these things and understand. I think that the thing that I have mentioned about the tension inside companies between the business side and the engineering side, I've seen it in so many places that successful companies are able to walk and chew gum.
Yep.
And
then they're cynical.
Yeah, so I kind of try to walk on both sides of that line myself. So I do IT support for small businesses, but it's just me. I don't have a sales guy. So I get to be the guy that goes in and talks to ye old small business owner who in some cases has a clue and in some cases does not have a clue about how their technology works. And it is a different thought process. Doing the actual IT support is a much different thought process than doing the sales and talking to kind of your CEO type. And I think a lot of people kind of on the engineering side, the more geeky types, don't understand that it's a whole different language.
I try my best to try to have a foot in both circles because it's really important. It's how you don't get to understand how things happen if you don't have a foot, in both circles of influence, right? Like engineering decisions are often influenced by business needs, and business needs are often influenced by market reactions or the next crazy fad or whatever. And having to understand how these things fit together also can help you navigate against making some supremely bad decisions. And if you don't know that, you're gonna get screwed.
So it's interesting to talk about that tension thing because so there was an author called C.P. Snow who wrote an essay called Two Cultures back in the 50s. And in there he lamented the cultural divide between the human intellectual activity of sciences and the human intellectual activity of the arts. And I think it's still the same divide.
Yeah, it is. It is essentially the same divide because, like, you're thinking about when you look at engineering, typically people, I hate this characterization, but a lot of times people consider engineering to be relationship averse and to be, mechanical in nature, right? But engineering is about relationships. It's about solving people's problems. That's really the art of engineering. The science of engineering is an art in itself, and the art is about solving problems. And on the business side, the art of the business is human relationships to define problems. You define problems to then be solved. You need both, or you're getting nothing.
So you started next week's reel already, have you, Jonathan?
We have. So we're in this middle of this transition going to Hackaday, and so getting guests lined up has been a little weird. We had somebody for today and had to bump them to next week, and the next week, the 27th, he ended up having to bump off to sometime in January. But it sounds like we're going to be back with Neal next week, and if I can swing it, I think I'm going to get either Dan or Sean to be here because they're really a couple of our Linux desktop guys, and so hopefully next week we're going to be back and talking about Fedora 40 and how crazy it is that I'm running Rawhide on the machine behind me. And, yeah,
and everything works.
Mostly, yeah.
Oh yeah, I like that. Hey, I was disappointed that there wasn't more excitement when I threw Rawhide on one of my laptops to try out the KDE Plasma 6 experience.
Well, there is some excitement to be had, but we will talk about that next week. So we want to say as we go, thank you to Hackaday for letting us be here, for picking up the show. Thank you to Neal for being here. Thank you to Simon so much for stepping in, even though, Linux desktop is not your big thing, but hey, we made it work out. And boy, a great show today. So hey, we will see everybody next week on Floss Weekly.